There just seems so many times in our lives and when we're relating to God that God waits so long to do things, and it's very frustrating to us. We think that God should be more responsive, that God should be more on our timetable, and it gets very difficult to us when it seems that God waits so long, or sometimes too long, to accomplish things. We place a lot of value on prayer, and for several reasons, obviously. One is because the Bible tells us you should place a lot of value on prayer. But secondly, because we have experienced that prayer works, that prayer is valuable, that our experiences tell us that prayer is worthwhile. But we also know that there are so many times when God just doesn't seem to do things as we're praying for them, that He's not answering our prayers. And we're often told God's timing is not our timing, that God's time is not our time. And so we know, and we also know that there's far more to the picture of how prayer works. The Bible has lots to say about prayer, that prayer has to be with the right motives, and prayer has to be not with selfish gain in it, and prayer has to be, from the right heart, and all of that. And we understand that. But I think what would help us to grasp this a little bit better is if we use the Bible to observe what God's patterns are. When we get to know a friend, we get to know the way they do things. We learn the way they think. By spending time with them, we come to understand more of what makes them tick. And that's what we're looking for in the Bible, is how does God work? How does He approach these things, and what does He do? And it's been one of my observations through the years that God often waits till the 11th hour to take care of stuff. And it's very frustrating to us that it doesn't happen, and then all of a sudden, right at the last minute. But we need to see in the Bible that this is God's pattern. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is so that we recognize that it's God doing these things, and that it was not a natural occurrence. If they just happened, it'd be pretty easy to say, well, I guess it just happened. I don't really know if God did this or not. But by waiting until the last minute, it reinforces for us that this was an act of God and not something that happened naturally. Just some of the examples of this in the Bible. God had told Samuel to anoint David as king, but then David has to wait years and years and years and be chased around the wilderness, and he could probably wonder, I thought God wanted me to be the king. Why is this taking so long? We see in another instance in Absalom's rebellion, David's son had rebelled against him, and it got worse and it got worse and it got worse. And finally, David had to sneak out of Jerusalem and, in a sense, run for his life. And he could easily say, where is God when I need Him? How come He's not responding? But this is the way that God's pattern is, that God waits until the last minute to do something. In the time of Hezekiah, the Assyrians were making siege against Jerusalem, and you'd almost think that God would have protected them so that the Assyrians would not be there. But the Assyrians come, they lay siege, they are there until the Jerusalemites are a little desperate. And that's when God intervenes. This is just His pattern. Hezekiah's illness, where he is worried for his very life, and it's not till his life is hanging by a thread that God does something about it. The book of Esther, it's like the night before the execution that the execution is stayed, and Haman is hanged on the gallows. But what about the disciples? The disciples are on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is sleeping in the boat until the disciples get to the part where they are pretty confident they are going to die. And these were experienced sailors. And they wake Jesus and say, "Don't you care that we are going to drown?" And that's when Jesus wakes up and says, "Peace, be still." You see, so we see this pattern pretty consistently that God just waits and waits and waits until it's right at the edge of too late to intervene. And it's so hard for us. But that's not the only pattern we see. There are lots of times when we see that God waits until it is too late. The story of Ruth, Naomi's husband dies. Ruth's husband dies, Orpah's husband died. They're in a desperate situation, and it's not like, well, they were sick unto death. They had died. It was too late for them. But God still was able to redeem the situation as they returned to Bethlehem and Ruth met Boaz. What about the night when the angel appeared to Jesus' father, Joseph, and said, "You need to run for your life, escape to Egypt because their soldiers are coming." And why did he wait so long? Why did he wait until it was right on the edge and they had to run for their lives? But there are times when God just waits until it's too late. Jairus comes to Jesus and says, "My daughter's really sick. She's going to die." And Jesus is on his way, and the woman in the crowd stops him to touch the hem of his robe. And I'm sure Jairus or his servants are there saying, "Come on, Jesus, come on. My daughter's..." And then the message comes that the daughter had died, and you can just imagine that they go, you waited too long. Time matters. It matters that, and now she's dead. But, of course, Jesus redeems the situation and brings the daughter back to life. We see the same thing with Lazarus in John chapter 11. The word comes to Jesus, our brother is sick. And Jesus just waits there for a few more days. He just waits there, and you can imagine. Well, and we hear the frustration of the sisters when Jesus finally arrives, and they say, "You know what? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. You waited too long." But then, of course, Jesus redeems the situation. What seems to be too late in our timing is not at all too late in God's timing. You see, because where Jesus is, there is always hope. And that's a very important part here. We see some of those stories in the Old Testament. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they are resisting Nebuchadnezzar, they stand up and you think, well, God might save us from this. But we notice that God doesn't save them from that. They actually get tossed in the fiery furnace. But then, of course, God does redeem the situation when it's too late. He redeems the situation, and they are spared and saved because there's the presence of God with them in the fiery furnace. Even though to us it looks like it's too late, with God there is no such thing. We see the same thing, of course, in Daniel chapter 6, when Daniel's in the lion's den. He actually gets chucked in the lion's den. But it's never too late as long as God is present. Wherever God is present, there is always hope, even when it's too late, right? But then there are times when we see that God just does not intervene. One of those is John the Baptist. John the Baptist gets killed. James, the brother of John in the book of Acts, I think it's Acts chapter 12, where James gets martyred. It happens. And so there are times when God waits till the 11th hour. There is time when God waits until 12:30, when it's too late. So the things have already happened. Death has already taken place. Or when the 3 Hebrew men are thrown into the fiery furnace. There's also, though, the story of Stephen. God does not intervene. Stephen dies that day in Acts chapter 7. So we have to face that as a reality, that there are some times when it is not God's will to intervene at the 11th hour. It is not God's will to intervene at 12:30 either. He doesn't intervene at all. But I was having a conversation with somebody in Ghana the other day, and he was telling me that, that he is told by the church there that if ever God doesn't intervene, it's because you lacked faith. And he said, where they tell me if God doesn't answer my prayer, it's my fault because I didn't have enough faith. And I explained some of these situations. I said, that's just a lie. That is not always the case. Sometimes it's the case that you don't have enough faith, but I would say not very often. God has many reasons for when he intervenes and why he intervenes, and sometimes why he does not intervene. He's not going to intervene in every situation, but if we look at the patterns that the Bible teaches us and learn from what we are seeing, it can help us understand God better. And that means we can act more wisely, and we can also teach others about God more responsibly, where we won't say things like, if you just have enough faith, you will always get what you pray for. Or that, that God will always respond to you and say, God is not like enslaved to us, where he is obligated to respond as long as we do 1, 2, and 3. That's not the way it works. God's will is governed by God, and sometimes it's his will to intervene in a timely manner. Sometimes, though, we have to be people of faith and perseverance and pray until the 11th hour. Sometimes we see that it's even God's will to intervene when we consider that it's just too late. Like, way to go, God, you waited too long. Maybe 1,000 years is like a day to you, but a day is like a day to me, and it matters. Because you waited too long, now it's too late. But we see that there are patterns in the Bible where sometimes there is no such thing as too late sometimes. And then there are other times when, as I explained, it's just God's will that bad things happen. And so we need to understand God's patterns so we can be responsible in how we live our lives in his presence.